Hi guys, welcome back. Today we're talking about ISO. As a bit of a refresher for you, ISO is one of your corners of your exposure triangle next to your aperture and shutter speed, and it's often the one that will be adjusted last by photographers because they have set their aperture and shutter speed to what they want, and the ISO is there to fill in the gap, so to speak, so that they can get the correct exposure to be able to get an image that they can actually use. But what is ISO? ISO refers to how sensitive your sensor is at capturing light. A low ISO level such as ISO 100 means your sensor doesn't have to be too sensitive to capture light because you've set your aperture and your shutter speed at a range where enough light is getting in for your sensor to capture that you don't need to adjust those levels. A high ISO like ISO 12,800 as a random example means your sensor's got to be very sensitive to try and capture as much light as possible because not enough is getting into the sensor itself from whatever aperture and shutter speeds you have set. But in saying that, having a high ISO level does also introduce noise and grain to your image, plus have a few other changes to it as well, mostly in the color. But this then begs the question, when does a photo have too much noise in it? Unfortunately, there is no right or wrong answer to that because that's all down to personal preference. Some photographers, like myself, love to have a low ISO image, and I will do nearly whatever it takes to get my ISO down as low as possible, even if it means a 2-minute exposure, provided it's not affecting my aperture, I should say. Whereas some photographers I know that they will embrace the fact that you need a high ISO to get the image because they are at least able to get the image they want based on having set their aperture and shutter speed to the correct levels as well. So how do you know when ISO will start to affect your image with your particular camera? Well, the best way to do that is to actually take your camera out and take a picture of exactly the same scene at multiple ISO levels and then see exactly how they change as you go from something like ISO 100 all the way up to ISO 25,000. Because by doing this, then you'll understand, okay, at this ISO number, that's when I start receiving a lot of noise in my image and there's even a bit of color change, but anything below that is still manageable and easy enough to fix in post. And that's what we're going to do shortly. We're going to jump on the computer and into Lightroom because I've taken an image of exactly the same rock at multiple ISO levels, starting at ISO 100 going all the way up to ISO 25,600. So that you can see how, at least on my Canon EOS R, when noise starts to get introduced, but also when there's a bit of a color difference to the image as well. But before we jump on the computer, I just want to quickly say we're not going to do too much pixel peeping today. I found that when you do pixel peep, more than anything, you'll find there's always going to be something that you want to fix, that you'll never be satisfied with the photo because you'll want to fix nearly every pixel that you see. Whereas it comes in handy occasionally just to make sure there's no weird artifacts that are there. But for today's purpose, we're not going to pixel peep too much because we just need to see exactly when noise gets introduced into the photo and when the color changes at high ISO levels as well. So let's jump the computer and you'll see exactly what it is I mean. I've got a few examples here of the same picture that I took at different settings to increase the ISO level. What I did was I set the aperture at exactly the level I wanted, and then all I did was change the shutter speed and adjust the ISO accordingly. To make sure that I kept the exposure relatively similar, I used the light meter on my camera to make sure I was always at -1 stop, and then I just adjusted the shutter speed and ISO to keep it at that level. As you move through the images, you can see that as the ISO level increases, it doesn't really change the image until you get to about here at ISO 5000, where if you zoom up here and on the water, not too much, but you can see that this is where there is a little bit of noise in the image. Whereas if you step back here to ISO 2500, there is a little bit of noise, but it's not too noticeable, and definitely not as noticeable compared to ISO 5000, or even at the next one at ISO 6400, where you can see the image is starting to get very noisy already. But we'll zoom out, and what we'll do is we'll start again at ISO 100, and as we move through, pay attention to the color, because once we get to about ISO 12,800, that's when you'll really notice that the shade of green has changed on the algae on the rocks, and that's something to be aware of when you are shooting at higher ISO levels as well. So as we move through, here we go. ISO 500, it's still relatively the same. 800, 1600, it's already a little bit darker, but that's probably my exposure. But once we get to here at ISO 12,800, if you just compare it to the previous one at 6400 and look at the algae on the rocks, you can see that it is significantly different in comparison. And this is keeping everything else completely the same. And once we go up to ISO 20,000, once again, it's completely different as well. And also at ISO 25,600. Now, I deliberately stopped it at 25,600 because I didn't see the point in going any higher than that. I have had to on very, very, very rare occasions before, like once when I was shooting the full moon and I had no idea what I was doing when I was doing it handheld and my camera was set to auto ISO. All I did was close my aperture as much as possible and increase the shutter speed as much as possible. And then I got this very noisy image of the moon, which I ended up never using as it is because there was just too much noise. And no matter how much post-processing work I did, it just didn't look good, so I binned it completely. So now that we've seen how ISO can affect both the noise in your image plus how it can change the color as well, how can we fix this? There's actually 3 separate ways that we can do this. 2 ways are when you're out and about in the field, and the third way is actually in post-production. It's a neat trick that I've learned recently, and it does actually work quite well, assuming you've got a relatively new camera within the past couple of years, I should say. So the way to fix these when you're out and about largely depends on whether or not you've got a tripod with you. In these cases, I did have a tripod because the very first image I took, which was at ISO 100, required a 1-second exposure, which without in-body stabilization or something to raise the camera on, is nigh on impossible to do handheld. But with a tripod, it's very doable. Because with a tripod, you have 2 options. One option is you can extend your shutter speed like I did to reach 1 second, or if you're happy to do focus stacking in post-production later on, you can open your aperture to f4 instead of f14, bring your ISO down to a much more manageable level, do some focus stacks, and then merge them together in something like Photoshop later on once you're back at your computer. Whether you choose to either open your aperture or extend your shutter speed depends on what's actually going on in your photo. A prime example is with this one up here at Turmeda Beach, I was better off opening my aperture to keep my ISO down, because if I found when I did extend the shutter speed, it gave it too much of that milky look and the image just didn't have the action that I wanted it to capture from the waves crashing on the rocks. So I had to do a little bit of focus stacking at a wide open aperture to keep my ISO down to ISO 100. But in saying that, if there's other cases like this one up here above my head at Camp Cove, where it didn't matter what shutter speed I was using as long as my aperture was set correctly. In one case, I actually took an image where I extended it out to 3 minutes because that's what I needed to keep my ISO down at ISO 100 to prevent any noise whatsoever in entering the image. In saying that though, in most new mirrorless cameras today, you can easily go up to something like ISO 800 and you won't notice any difference in the noise levels because of how good the sensors are and how good most lenses are nowadays as well. Having that extra flexibility and breathing room in your ISO level means that you don't have to open your aperture as much or extend your shutter speed as much if you keep it to like ISO 800 instead of thinking about getting all the way down to ISO 100 in comparison. But which one you do, whether it's to open your aperture or extend your shutter speed, that literally comes down to the case that you're in. In this case, it was open my aperture, and in this case, it was extend my shutter speed, and I was happy with either one because I had to adjust accordingly. But what if you don't have in-body image stabilization? Well, in that case, there is a way you can fix your image in post and it will still look pretty good compared to having a very shaky image because your shutter speed is longer than what you can do even with stabilization, or your aperture is too open and your depth of field is too shallow that too much of your image is not in focus depending on whatever it is you're trying to capture, that is. And to show you how to do that, we'll actually jump back into Lightroom because I've taken an image that's deliberately underexposed by about 2 or 3 stops, because that way you can see exactly how much you can recover in Lightroom when you have underexposed a photo. So if we look at this photo here, as you can see, it's very dark. I have applied the lens correction to it. So the first thing I'll do is I'm actually just going to bump this up all the way up to 2 stops. And as you can see, there is actually a lot more detail now, and you finally have an idea of what it is you can adjust. So let's increase the shadows a little bit. The highlights, I don't really need to touch them too much. We'll increase the contrast because I do like contrast in my photos. That should actually be fine as it is, and we'll increase the texture a little bit. Get up there. And the clarity. And as you can see, I've taken a picture that was massively underexposed, applied 2 stops to the exposure to increase it, and then tweaked it a little bit. And I've got an image that now looks a lot better, which keeps my ISO level down to a relatively decent level. You don't have to go to this extreme. This was just purely to show you how you can fix it in post if you did want to keep your ISO down so you don't introduce too much noise into an image. What you do when you're out there taking photos, it will literally depend on the sort of scenario that you're in. This was just an extreme example to show you how even when you're 2 stops underexposed, you can still bring back quite a bit of the data. I've just brought that image up to 3 stops right now, and as you can see, there's still quite a lot of detail in there, which means that's actually a pretty good thing that the camera can do, that I can shoot so far underexposed, increase it by 3 stops in Lightroom, and I've still got quite a lot of detail and I can still edit and get a decent image out of it. Whereas if I was to shoot that at a much higher ISO level and tried fiddling with the noise reduction in Lightroom, it's not going to look that great. Which brings us onto a contentious tool which I've deliberately left for last, and that is, should you use your noise reduction tool in Lightroom or Photoshop? And the answer is, it depends on a few variables. Firstly, it depends just how much noise there is in the photo, because the more noise there is and the more you apply that noise reduction tool, what it does is it's actually going to smoothen out your photo quite a bit. So you are going to lose quite a bit of sharpness and detail in there, which you will have to try and rectify afterwards. But then it also depends what you're going to do with that image. If you're just going to be sharing it online or in social media or making small prints out of it like 4x6, it's probably less of a concern if you have used it, because then you can use those sharpening tools or Photoshop Smart Sharpen filter to try and make back some of the detail. But if you're going to do something like these ones, or even larger prints, or heck, even an A4 print, then it will be quite noticeable that it has been applied, or that what you'll actually get is a softer image than if you just left a bit of noise in there. I have used it a little bit in the past when I had a very noisy photo, but when it comes to taking photos now, I just accept that that's what I had to do to get the photo I wanted. And if it's a little bit noisy, so be it. I'd rather that I show you exactly how it is at the time versus spend 10 hours potentially ruining a photo because I've done so many edits to it that you don't even know what you're looking at anymore. So it largely depends on what it is you've taken a picture of and what you're going to do with that image as well, because there is no right and wrong. So as you can see, ISO can not just introduce some noise into your photo, but can also affect the colors in your photo as well. And the best way to find out where your individual camera starts to introduce noise or change the colors is to do exactly what I did, which is take it out to an area where there's quite a bit of color, put it on a tripod, and start tweaking the settings from ISO 100 all the way to whatever the max ISO range is, and then analyze it in whatever editing app it is you use so that you can see exactly where noise is introduced, but also where the color changes as well. Because in that way, once you're aware of this, then you know exactly what to do when you're out and about taking photos and think, hang on, is this ISO going to be too high, and how will it affect my photo, and what do I need to adjust accordingly to be able to get the best photo I've got. And every camera is different, so these are just the ones that I got my EOS R. It may be completely different with other Canon cameras. Not having played with them, I generally can't say. And it will probably be completely different with Nikon, Fujifilm, Sony cameras as well. The only way to do it is to try it out yourself. But please remember that at the end of the day, it's completely up to you what you determine to be an acceptable ISO level and how much noise can be introduced into an image, or the color change that may occur as well, because you're the one that's going out to take the photo. So as long as you're happy with it, that's what matters at the end of it. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. I hope that you've learned something, especially what ISO is related. If you do have any questions about this, please don't forget to leave a comment down below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can, or get in touch with me at any of my social media channels as well. If you have liked this video, please do give it a thumbs up. That will be greatly appreciated, as it does help that YouTube algorithm out quite a lot. And if you want to make sure you don't miss out on any future videos, or if you want to see previous videos as well, hit that subscribe button and tick that little bell, because that way you'll always get a notification every time a new video comes out. I'll leave it there for today. As always, have a good night, and I'll see you on the next one.